She said, but it's something about the spirit of justice. And she described like this warhorse scene that's been put out to pasture, but it hears the trumpet sound and its back raises up. And she said, and you become determined all over again.
You're listening to Good Faith Weekly. I'm Mitch Randall.
And I'm Missy Randall.
We're here each week exploring the intersection of faith and culture.
We find people who stand up, speak out, and step forward.
For inclusion, freedom, and justice for all.
It's time for Good Faith Weekly.
Brought to you by Good Faith Media. Welcome to Good Faith Weekly. On this episode, Missy and I are going to catch up. We're going to talk about opening weekend for college football and then catch up on a few of the news items over the weekend. And then Missy and I sat down with Dr. Jemar Tisby. Dr. Tisby has a new book out titled The Spirit of Justice, True Stories of Faith, Race, and Resistance. It's an absolutely great pod that you're not going to miss. Hello there, Missy.
Hey, how are you?
I'm well, and you?
I'm riding a high of...
It's because I'm back in studio, right?
Yeah, sure. No.
That was a screech.
I've got my pom-poms here and am just riding high of the beginning of college football last weekend.
Which is so weird for you to say.
I've always been a football fan, but lately...
we spent four days watching college football.
4 days. It started on Friday of the holiday weekend and went all the way through Monday night. There was a college game. So it was such fun. I love the start of college football, especially because it signals the beginning of fall for me.
Absolutely.
It's like the holidays are coming, all things pumpkin and cooler weather and sweaters, which lead us into Christmas. So for me, it's like I enjoy football, but it's more about like what that signifies. What is that like is it Palm Sunday?
Yes.
The entry that like it
right.
signifies.
Yeah.
Okay, so this is
it's the triumphant entry.
my pop culture. Yes, Palm Sunday happened.
You could be a preacher with
happened last weekend.
That kind of analogy.
That's right. But then I got to get into scripture and find the parallel, and then I'm lost.
Okay, so out of the weekend, we watched several different games. Our hometown team here, the Oklahoma Sooners, won, but they played a smaller team.
It's kind of I don't like
tough.
those first week games where they're
Yeah.
incredibly mismatched or a little
But
bit.
there were some big games on too, and one of the biggest games that we watched was the Fighting Irish of Notre Dame versus Texas A&M Aggies. And you're a Texan, kind of followed the Aggies
I know.
a little bit.
I'm a long time kind of grew up kind of rooting for the Aggies, and
the Irish beat the Aggies.
It was. I'm going to get in so much trouble with my family if they listen.
Give me your Texas card right now.
I know. I kind of enjoyed it because they were at Kyle Field, but it was a whole thing. Yes, they won. And sorry, family, Aggies, sorry, but it was kind of fun to watch.
Yeah.
But then the next one we really enjoyed was the Monday night game, which was Boston College versus Florida State, right?
Yes. Before we get that, let's back up a little bit because we had kind of a conundrum between one of the big games where we watched LSU play USC, and we really didn't like either one of those teams.
No, but it was just we wanted them both to do poorly.
Yes.
I don't know. Anyways, it's a whole thing.
It's a whole thing. But let's go back to that Monday night game.
So Boston College played Florida State.
Florida State, big favorite in the game.
Big program, yeah. I assume they were a favorite.
Oh,
I don't know. But because we've got a kiddo in Boston, we love it. Obviously, we're going to root for Boston College in this game. And I honestly don't know why, but I have been conditioned, groomed, whatever, to hate all Florida schools. I don't know why.
Sorry, Florida folks.
I know. So I'm automatically rooting against Florida, which, again, with the USC Florida game. Anyways. So we started rooting for Boston College Monday night, and oh my gosh, they handedly won that game.
Yeah, I mean they just put a whooping.
So that was a fun end to the weekend,
It was.
and then we've gone now 4 days without any college football. This is so stupid. I don't know how this relates to faith and culture, other than just culture.
Are you kidding? We live in the South. It is religion.
Okay, it is religion. You're right. So here I am with my pom poms. Anyways, we've enjoyed the start to college football. Primarily because it signifies the start of fall.
That's right. And along with the start of football and the beginning of fall, we had a Labor Day weekend. And so we had an extra day to ourselves. We want to give a big shout out to all of our unions out there who do an incredible job standing up for skilled workers and the labor force all across this country. They do a terrific job. And thank you for Labor Day.
Yes, and I've really enjoyed the last few years as at least, the algorithms have fed me more articles and more information about Labor Day and about the policies set in place and the people who fought for those policies to help ensure we have worker protections. I know we have a long way to go, but I'm real appreciative of reading those, and it always kind of is a good reminder. Oddly enough, that's not something we were taught growing up, but I'm thankful for that information coming in now. So,
and as we were celebrating Labor Day, something kind of unusual happened to us.
yeah, we had an interesting experience over the long weekend. We were running errands one afternoon, and were stopped for a Sonic drink, of course.
Of course.
I mean, of course. So while we were waiting for our drink, you had popped on social media because, of course, that's what we do. And you noticed a post from someone who is a Facebook friend of yours in town, this gentleman who owns a local, like a boutique gift shop.
It's a wonderful little shop.
It's one of my
great little trinkets.
If I have a gift to buy for somebody,
things,
that it's just our go-to store.
Right.
And he posted online on his personal page about kind of a jarring experience that he had where someone called his store and threatened him. And to give a little context, this store, it has a little like funny items, like, dish towels that you hang that have funny sayings or, candy from your childhood, just this kind of store. But always this store is, to me, kind of known for the socks.
Yes.
They have all the funny like sayings, like,
and some snarky socks.
I mean, I got
They're
you
fun.
some there one time years ago when you were in the local pastorate going to tons of committee meetings, and the bottom of the sock said this meeting is bull.
Yeah.
Yeah, like things like
Things
that.
like that, yeah.
So in the window, he has displayed all of
Right.
these things. And in the window, he also had some socks, like tube socks for Kamala Harris. And so someone in the community saw it and called him, strangely enough, blocked their caller ID.
Strange.
Yeah. And threatened him and said, you need to take those socks out of the window or I will do it for you.
Right.
And, you think he was rattled by the experience and posted about it online. And so you and I, of course, were out running errands. So we're like, we're going to go, support the store. So we did. We drove over there and bought some gift items because, they always have things you find that you need.
Oh, sure.
And talked to him for a little bit. But it was just, we've had a lot of follow-up conversations about that since the experience of what it means to be able to have free speech as a store owner and as a consumer. And so we thought we'd talk about that a little bit.
Yeah. Well, in this particular case, obviously, you just said a moment ago that he did have some Kamala Harris socks in his window. And as I have alluded to in some of my writings recently, as I travel around, there are certain stores that, offer Trump memorabilia as well. And so I think it's important for us as a society to recognize that individual's right to promote and to sell whatever they want to. I mean, they have the right to do that. And they also have the right not to be threatened because of that conscience.
Right. I think that's where it comes down to. If we're going to live in a capitalistic society, right? The store owner gets to choose. Now, I can choose where I shop based on what they're promoting or what they're selling or advertising. And so as I have more wrestled with this than you have of where to draw that line. Another experience we had recently came to mind where we were shopping for a car, which is like the worst thing, the side of hell. And we were in a dealership one day and walked into a salesperson's office to talk to them. And when we left, you turned to me and you said, we won't be buying a car here. And I said, why? And you happened to notice something prominently displayed in the salesperson's office that directly went against what you and I believe in ideologically.
Sure.
But we didn't call and threaten him.
No.
We're just like, this is not where we're going to give our business.
Right.
And that was that.
Yeah. And
So
I think
to me, that's the line.
Yeah, I think that's the line. I think that's the difference. Any type of violence or the threat of violence is always inappropriate in circumstances like this.
Right.
If you don't like what the proprietor of a business stands for or is selling, don't go in the store and don't buy the merchandise. It's as simple as that. But any type of threat of violence is absolutely, unequivocally wrong. And so we felt really bad for this owner of this little business. So we went and bought a few things at the store.
We did. And you just can't imagine. It's like if you talk to somebody who's, I'm not equating it, but when you talk to somebody who's been robbed,
Right.
And they'll say it's not what was taken, it's that feeling of vulnerability and violation that they feel. And that's kind of the vibe I got from him is like he was, he's an older gentleman, and this is a small community. Just, I don't know, that feeling of, am I safe? Is my business safe? Is my home safe? Is my
Right.
family safe? It really rattles a person. So
Sure.
I don't know. It was just kind of an interesting
It
experience.
wasn't interesting, but he really appreciated our conversation, and we had a great talk with him. And some of our friends actually saw the same post and went over and bought some merchandise from him too. So,
Yeah, so I hope it just dies down.
I
But
do
at
too.
the same time, you never know.
yeah, absolutely. So there is one other story I want to get to before we sit down with Dr. Jemar Tisby, which is a fabulous interview, by the way, that you're going to want to stay for. There is a story out of Somerville, Massachusetts, that is a little town, or not a little town, but it's a suburb of Boston, that I just found very interesting. And there's no conclusion to this story yet, so I want to tell you that. But it's something I think that everybody should keep an eye on because I think it really speaks to the church's desire as well as legal ability to help the least of these in their community. So First Church of Somerville, Massachusetts owns an apartment complex in town, and they want to turn it into a homeless shelter. They have acquired the correct permits. The law is actually on their side. But as you can imagine, there are some neighbors in the area who do not want that apartment complex turned into a homeless shelter. So they have filed suit to shut it down. And it's just a really interesting case of what is a church allowed to do with the property it owns out of religious convictions versus what are the rights of other people who live in the community. What kind of say do they have about what the church does in their own community?
So I don't want to open a whole nother can of worms. I know we've gone long, but this is interesting to me. So are you saying that a church is pretty much allowed to use their property that they own
Well, they have to,
for whatever?
not for whatever they can do, but they do have to convince the permit gods of their area.
Let's don't use that word.
Okay.
But the city or
whoever grants the
zoning or
permits.
whatever.
Yeah, zoning,
yeah.
probably. They have to commit the zoning commission that they are acting out of a religious conviction, and they have to obviously detail what they're planning on doing with the facility, which they did, and they were granted the permit by the city. Well, now
The neighbors aren't
the neighbors
happy.
are not
Okay.
happy. And listen to this quote by this one neighbor, and I'm not going to name her name, but you can find her name in the Boston Globe. This is her speaking. They, the church, believe in the idea that Christianity says they should be helping the homeless, which is fine.
Love your neighbor, right?
But aren't you supposed to love your neighbors as well?
That's so interesting. What a tension point.
It is such a tension point. So nothing's been concluded about it, but it's an interesting story that we're following here at Good Faith Media. We'll keep you up to date.
I mean,
about
it's such a church state tension there
It is.
because the church should be allowed to do their job.
right?
But to what degree that, includes putting anyone else potentially at I don't know, risk is not the right word that I'm looking
Right.
for, but makes anyone else feel like their rights are being infringed upon.
Mm-hmm.
Where does the answer lie?
Well, I'm guessing, a lot of the arguments in other cases like this have been from community residents who said, they're worried about safety, which may or may not be true, but probably the real juxtaposition of this is they're worried about property values.
Safety, property values, all the things that you hear, which,
Right.
it's not all without any sort of merit to be considered, but it makes me think also of the folks who will say when they don't want government social services, and they say,
oh my goodness.
oh, the church should be doing this. We need to let the church do this. Well, okay, here's a case where the church is trying.
Right.
And you're telling them, no, you can't.
Oh, you went there.
So I did. Maybe he started down a path I didn't. Maybe I want the U-turn signal now, but it is a case of that.
No, I
like
think
the
you're
church
exactly
is
right.
the church is trying to do what they're called to do. Like, okay, if our government's not going to take care of this population, we're going to do something to help.
Yeah.
So it's like, which one do you want here?
Yeah.
And I don't know.
Yeah, we don't want to pay for these social services. We want churches and faith-based organizations to do this work, but with the caveat, we don't want you to do it here.
It's almost like people of privilege want people without privilege and means to be invisible.
Oh, wow, that's profound. You're right.
Is it? Okay, so thanks. And at the end of the day, human beings are not. We're all created in the image of God. We are all God's children. We are not invisible.
Oh my gosh, that may be the best thing you've ever said on this show.
Wow. Maybe I do need to be a preacher.
That really was amazing. Thank you. Well, speaking about amazing things and speaking about the visibility of everybody in this world, you and I get to sit down with one of the world's great historians when it comes to racial justice in America, Dr. Jemar Tisby. Dr. Tisby has a brand new book out titled The Spirit of Justice, True Stories of Faith, Race, and Resistance, and it is superb, and we had a delightful time talking with him.
He was great. He's wonderful. I can't believe this is the first time to have him on the
I know.
podcast because I feel like we've interacted, we've crossed paths, we know him, so it just felt like talking to an old friend. I really enjoyed it.
Absolutely. So stay tuned.
I'm Reverend Starlette Thomas, Director of the Raceless Gospel Initiative at Good Faith Media and host of the Raceless Gospel Podcast. It's season 5, and we are giving you a love offering, an audio audit of the North American Church's messages about giving. A love offering. Join me, Reverend Starlette Thomas, your podcast pastor for season 5 of the Raceless Gospel Podcast. Our 7 episodes will drop weekly on Wednesdays, beginning September 4th. Subscribe wherever you listen to your favorite podcasts and learn more at goodfaithmedia.org.
Welcome back to Good Faith Weekly. On this episode, we've got a very special guest with us. Dr. Jemar Tisby is professor of history at Simmons College in Louisville, Kentucky, and former president of The Witness, a Black Christian collective where he writes about race, religion, politics, and culture. He is also the co-host of the Pass the Mic podcast. He has spoken nationwide at conferences, and his writing has been featured in the New York Times, The Atlantic, and CNN. Dr. Tisby is the author of How to Fight Racism, Courageous Christianity, and the Journey Toward Racial Justice, and The Color of Compromise, the truth about the American church's complicity in racism. His newest book, which was released this week, The Spirit of Justice, True Stories of Faith, Race, and Resistance, was released this week, as I just said. Dr. Tisby, welcome to Good Faith Weekly.
Hey, Mitch, and I'm dedicated to truth telling. So let me first drop a little bit of truth here.
Okay,
This is
all right,
unscripted.
excellent.
This is it's just you can't be a writer, an editor, a producer, a leader, and a manager, and have a great podcasting voice. That's just not fair. Stop it. Share the wealth. Share it.
Well,
We
I
always say
appreciate
he has
that.
a
Thank you.
face for radio.
I do have a face for radio. That's exactly right.
But a golden voice, I'll tell you. Oh, man. Yeah. It's wonderful to be here. Thank you.
Well, that means the world to me. Thank you so much.
Well, Dr. Tisby, thank you so much for joining us. The book was wonderful, but let's do what we're supposed to do and start from the beginning.
Yep.
In the opening of the book, you reference an experience you had that really helped inspire the book and the title, Spirit of Justice. So I thought maybe you could share a little bit about that with our listeners.
It's one of those moments that even in the moment, you almost have like an out-of-body experience, like this is going to be a marker in your life. So it was December 9th, 2017. It's the grand opening of the Mississippi Civil Rights Museum. I'm living in Jackson, Mississippi at the time, working, going to school. And I was able to attend a press conference after the public ceremony for the grand opening. And Myrlie Evers Williams was speaking. Folks will remember her because her husband, Medgar, was assassinated on the front doorstep of their home in 1963 for his work with the NAACP. So a journalist in this press conference asked Myrlie Evers Williams, well, how does now the 21st century compare to the 1960s and the civil rights movement in terms of justice? And it was kind of a depressing answer. She was like, I'm seeing things now that remind me of them.
Mm-hmm.
I'm seeing things, this negativity, this tension around race and this repression that I hoped I'd never see again. And then she says to this group, I'm in the room, and she
Mm-hmm.
says, I don't mind telling you, I'm a bit weary at this point, which is like the understatement of the century because she's
Right.
84 years old, and this is back in 2017. So of course she's weary, and I fully expected her to just be like, you know what, this is up to y'all. I have
Right.
done my part. I'm going to sit by the pool, sip a drink with an umbrella in it, and it's up to this next generation. But she didn't do that. She said something I will never forget. She said, but it's something about the spirit of justice.
Mm.
And she described like this warhorse scene that's been put out to pasture, but it hears the trumpet sound and its back raises up and it gets stiff and ready. And she said, and you become determined all over again.
Wow.
And I just, and I asked myself, how? Like, what is it in a person like this that drives them to say, we still got work to do, and I'm ready to do that work with you? And that's where this idea of the spirit of justice and this book about people throughout history, time and space have all tapped into this same spirit to continue the struggle against racism.
Well, I'm so glad that she inspired you to write this book because it is a masterpiece. I really was challenged and really thoroughly enjoyed The Color of Compromise. But working through the spirit of justice, Dr. Tisby, I was just mesmerized. You're a masterful storyteller. Thank you so much for putting this collection of stories together. But before we get to some of those stories, and there's so many that we could talk to you about today, I've got a question about setting the tone for your storytelling, because at the beginning of the book, you mention this very interesting topic to me. As an Indigenous person myself, I've been doing some deconstructing, and this realization that how religion plays a part, not necessarily, obviously it plays a part in my faith, but it's more than that. It's part of my culture. It's part of my identity. And you talk about that in the beginning of the book. And so how do Anglos understand religion differently than Africans? And what are the problems that arose from these differences? And also, how is that playing out today? Because I thought that was a fascinating point you made.
So I try to start in the colonial era, yes, but in Africa, right? Because the history of African Americans, it predates slavery, it predates contact with North America. So I talk about African indigenous spirituality, and I think it's very similar to indigenous folks in North America in the sense that all of life is integrated, the religious and the spiritual and the material. There's not this stark separation of the spiritual and the material. And that's a difference with European Christianity, white Christianity in North America, particularly on the issue of race and justice. So you'll hear a lot of Christians to this day saying that issues of racial justice or social justice are a, quote, distraction from the gospel. They're somehow extraneous to the so-called pure message of conversion, that you just need to follow Jesus, like the two aren't intertwined. And that's just very different from African spirituality and then later an African American style of Christianity. So I wanted to mention that because the idea that faith would drive one's efforts at justice is very organic in the Black Christian tradition. And it's something that you need to sort of level set at the beginning. And then you said, how does it show up today? Well, I think it shows up, number one, in you still have a lot of people who are working for justice in the Black community who are people of faith. You can think of prominent folks like Raphael Warnock, who literally occupies the same pulpit that MLK did at his church. and is also an elected senator. But you have so many others who I talk about in the penultimate chapter who are, leading marches and protests, leading nonprofits, leading churches, and they're doing justice work as an outgrowth of their faith.
Mhm.
And they're doing it in opposition to many Christians, many of them white, who would say that those efforts are not only extraneous to the gospel, but perhaps even anti-gospel.
Yeah, I'd really loved this section because, as I said, working through my own deconstruction and decolonization of my faith as an Indigenous person here in North America, I learned recently that in a lot of Indigenous cultures here in North America, there is no word for religion. There's no concept of religion. It's just part of identity and personhood and life. And I thought, wow, what you're writing about in this book really paralleled with what I'm learning on my own. So thank you so much for that.
Wow.
In one section of the book, you talk about the American Revolution and the language of freedom that the founders instilled. Yet, as we all know, that freedom did not extend to all people. But I wondered if you could talk a little bit about the hypocrisy of that, but also about the spirit of freedom that was kind of unleashed as a result.
I love it. You all actually read the book. I appreciate that. Or maybe like slid it. You did in school, like these chapters. I'll take these.
We're not big enough to have researchers, so we got to do the work.
I appreciate it. Yeah, I mean, that's the inherent contradiction in the so-called birth of this nation. Is it's supposedly founded on the idea of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, all men being created equal, as the Declaration says, right? And this is part of the controversy of the 1619 Project, which essentially says, let's do a thought experiment and say, what if 1776 and the Declaration of Independence wasn't the true founding of the nation? What if it was 1619 with the arrival of enslaved Africans to British Virginia, right? And it's getting at this fact that there is this language of liberty in not only the Declaration, but also the Constitution, and also sort of in the ether. And you can read newspapers from around then. It's everywhere. Colonies are talking about liberty. Well, Black folk ain't stupid. Now, yeah, they hear this language and like, excuse me, raise my hand. What about us who you're enslaving, who we're in bondage, and you're talking about freedom and liberty and equality? And so they did what Black people in this country have always done. They took this stuff that they got from Europeans and white people, and they remixed it into something liberative and declared their dignity and their freedom. So they had freedom suits. They would sue in courts, or they would petition state governments and basically say, hey, y'all talk about liberty and whatnot. We're going to use that same rhetoric, that same language, and say that we should be free too. In some cases, they were successful. In many cases, they were not. But it shows how, even at the time when this stuff was happening, Black people saw the contradiction. But instead of like just saying, "No, America, you're trash. You're not about liberty," they said, "Okay, if you are about liberty, then let's actually apply it and carry it to its logical conclusion, which is emancipation."
Let's move now into the 19th century. As the anti-slavery movement began across North America. And you do a great job depicting several individuals and stories that really reflect that time period. Like I said, I would love to sit here and talk about each and every one of these stories and individuals you mentioned in the book. But which one stood out to you as a story that many people may be familiar with, but its significance has been downplayed in history, but you see it as a linchpin or something that history hinges on, that something changed when this occurred, or this individual? I mean, Frederick Douglass, obviously, but is there another moment that really kind of, wow, this was bigger than I even thought?
So like in the abolitionist era you're talking about?
Yeah.
Yeah. Oh man, it's a really interesting era. So number one, historically speaking, what we now think about as slavery really coalesced in the early 1800s, from about the 1800 to 1840s, 1850s, right?
Mm-hmm.
That's when you get expansion west into places like Mississippi and the Delta, and you get like real cotton stuff, and you get this explosion of demand for enslaved laborers. That's also when the abolitionist movement really comes into its own. So understand that these dynamics are happening. This is the argument against the quote unquote men of their time phrase that people say, right? Have you heard when folks are when we're looking back at historical figures, particularly slaveholders or segregationists, many people in defense of those people will say, well, they were just men of their time. This was in the air. Everybody was doing it. We can't impose our modern day morals on historical figures.
Right.
Well, to which I say, what about the abolitionists? They were women and men of their time too. And they knew while it was happening, it was wrong. So this is where I bring in some white people. I talk about the Methodist anti-slavery tradition. John Wesley was very vocally opposed to slaveholding and slave trading. I talk about the early Quaker anti-slavery tradition and their sort of opposition to establishment in general and empire in general. And it didn't always hold. I mean, you get the Southern Methodists, and anytime you get Southern in front of a denomination, that means pro-slavery, right? But it was there, and it was there during the abolitionist movement. So there are a lot of different turning points, but this is one area where I thought it was important to point out that there are even white Christians who see the evils of slavery and want it abolished.
Yeah. And that leads, there's an entire section on the Civil War era, which was brilliant, but I want to skip ahead to the 20th century and the civil rights movement. You have a chapter titled Beyond the Quotable King, which I thought was brilliant because everybody quotes Dr. King, liberals, moderates, conservatives, everybody has this tendency to quote King. But in that chapter, you write, King's facility with words has become a double-edged sword. What did you mean by that statement?
So King is so eloquent, such a powerful orator and writer. People forget he wrote several books. Read them. That we sort of reduce him to those words.
Right.
And we don't look holistically at his life. And particularly, we don't look at the faith that drove his activism. So I wanted to write an entire chapter on a well-known figure because it's precisely because he's well-known that he's been mythologized. And we've forgotten the man behind the myth. So I wanted to get beyond, number one, that most famous quote that he doesn't want his children to be judged by the color of their skin, but the content of their character, which has been ripped from context and abused and used against the very things that he stood for. And I wanted to talk about King, the preacher and churchman, King, the scholar, King, the person who had a crisis of faith in the Montgomery bus boycott, but has this powerful personal encounter with God that strengthens him. And I think that the people we know best are the ones we have to go back and analyze because what we remember about them has been so inflated and distorted by the public and popular memory.
Yeah, and there's so much. Another thing I thought you did really well in that chapter was kind of going beyond that dream language because yes, that was the heartbeat of Dr. King's message, but it was only part of his message because he talks about economic inequality. And that's that's the whole reason he's in Memphis when he was assassinated. Fighting for income inequality. His stance on the Vietnam War. There was so much more beyond what he said about racial justice. It doesn't downplay what he said about racial justice and inequality in the South and other parts of the country, but there's just so much more about him. So I personally really appreciated that section of the book. So thank you for writing it.
Absolutely.
It's almost like we like to take words of prophets and maybe twist, exclude some or just camp out on the ones that work for our purposes. I don't know.
Well, hey, look,
don't we?
Like, there's a conclusion to be drawn here.
Right. I mean, there's a parallel even to the way we treat scripture and Bible passages. Right. We'll take one verse, rip it out of context, apply it in any way that we that supports our pre-existing convictions, and then call that gospel truth. And we've done similar things to these towering figures of history like MLK, where we'll reduce his entire life and work to a single quote or a single moment. And there's just so much more to him. And by the way, I follow that chapter by Black women of the civil rights
Oh,
movement.
wow. Good
That's my
segue.
next
Great
question.
segue.
So yes, one of the sections that really meant a lot to me personally was that you did talk about the women. I mean, we obviously know a lot about men of the civil rights movement, but you did, give credit to women at that time. So tell us about some of them that maybe we don't know, especially, or some who are particularly important.
So I definitely will walk through some of the women I talk about in that chapter, but a little inside baseball. As historians, there's something called quote unquote great man history. And for a lot of time in the historical field, historians would write history based on these well-known men, and they were men. They're presidents, they're generals, they're folks like MLK, right? And there has been a move in the past several decades away from great man history to say, well, what about the grassroots? What about the women? What about the people who are left out of those traditional narratives? And so I had a real sort of struggle as an author and a historian writing a chapter on King, because does this feed into that great man history? I justified it by saying, okay, I'm trying to insert a more robust, nuanced picture of MLK, right? But I'm not ignoring the fact that Black women really not only made up the masses and the majority of the movement, but were really masterminds of the movement.
Right.
So, yeah, there's a chapter on King, but there's a whole section on Coretta Scott King. And she has this powerful line in her autobiography. She says, something to the effect of, there's a Coretta and there's a Mrs. King, and somehow the first got lost in the last,
Right.
And she's basically saying, I was my own woman and am my own person, aside from being a spouse, aside from my husband's legacy. And she literally becomes a global human rights activist. And by the way, what we do know about MLK is thanks to her forethought to collect his papers and letters and books and all of this stuff. And within weeks of his assassination, she starts the King Center. And that becomes a repository of the archives and the memory that we now have of MLK, in addition to advocating for the holiday that finally gets passed in the 1980s, in addition to, working against apartheid in South Africa, advocating for the poor, taking a nonviolent anti-war stance in so many cases. So, like, she's just one example. I also talk about Ruby Dee, an actress who I really love, because this is the 1960s. Speaking out about race in the field of entertainment could tank your career.
Yeah.
And there are many people, even today, many stars and actors and stage and all screen stars, who refuse to take a strong stance for justice because they don't want to not get the part. They don't want to be blacklisted, so to speak, in the industry. But she, at great risk, did so herself. Talk about Dorothy Height. I talk about Prathia Hall, from whom MLK got that phrase, I have a dream. You need a Blackwell, the first Black mayor of Mississippi, and just this constellation of Black women who, as I said, masterminded the movement.
Yeah. And I think you solidified your point, because you look at the jacket of the book, and, it would have been easy to put Dr. King on there, but you put Coretta on there. And, and so it was just brilliant. And as you were speaking about Coretta and Dr. King, we were recently in Boston, and we walked through the Commons, and there's that statue of Dr. King and Coretta Scott King, the embrace. And when we heard the artist talk about that piece, you literally cannot tell where their arms start and end. They're so intertwined and connected together. And you could not have a Martin without Coretta. And I think that was just really, really brilliantly done. And your book solidifies that, especially that section on Coretta Scott King. So thank you. So, all right. So again, we could talk all day about this, but unfortunately, we're limited for time. But let's talk about the end of the book, because you discuss faith's role in the March for Freedom, and I want to talk about, in particular, a couple of sentences you wrote. You write, "The true stories featured in the spirit of justice differ in a multitude of ways, but what binds them together is the role of faith. We too often pass over the role religion plays in the story of the Black freedom struggle." So, Dr. Tisby, where is that march for freedom today? And where are the voices from the faith community that we need to be listening to, talking about justice in today's context?
So, quite simply, we cannot understand the Black freedom struggle if we do not understand that the role that faith played in the people who were advocating for justice. And when you look at history and so many of the people who we now admire for their stances on justice, they are people of faith, and Christians in particular. So I wanted this book to highlight that this is not just an add-on, an addendum, extraneous to, but integral to the work of justice. And as we look at today, I wrote a whole chapter called The Next Justice Generation, the Next Justice Generation. And I wanted to highlight that, like, this isn't just an issue of the past. This is still ongoing. We are in this stream of the freedom struggle that is still flowing today. As we look at the spirit of justice and how it manifests today, we look at the church as a people who may not be centralized or concentrated in a particular denomination or even congregation, but they are the church doing the work of the kingdom of God. And so in that chapter on the Next Justice Generation, I talk about this truly 21st century class of people called the creatives. These are Christians who are social media savvy. They are content creators making videos and memes and tutorials and things of that nature, and using the tools of modern technology to advocate, to promote justice, even to mobilize movements in a way that could only be done in this digital information age. So the spirit of justice still is at work. It does change form over time, and we just need to have the eyes to see how it's still at work today.
Well, at the top of that list of the voices that we need to be listening to, I want to add Dr. Jemar Tisby, because his books, his writing, his Substack, if you don't follow his Substack, go to it, subscribe. It's terrific. And one of the things I did forget to mention in the introduction is that Dr. Tisby is a contributing correspondent for us. And we repost some of his Substacks at goodfaithmedia.org, and we really appreciate him letting us do that. But Dr. Tisby, it has been an absolute pleasure and honor to speak with you today. Congratulations on the book. The book is available now, The Spirit of Justice, True Stories of Faith, Race, and Resistance. Trust me, as soon as you click end on this podcast, go buy it. It is outstanding. So please purchase the book. But Dr. Tisby, before we let you go, you are the 225th guest on Good Faith Weekly, and we've been asking this question to every one of our guests, and Missy has the honor of asking it. So I'm going to turn it over to her for our final question.
So, Dr. Tisby, as you know, our tagline at Good Faith Media is "There's more to tell." So, in light of your work and our conversation today, what is your more to tell?
I kind of want to end on a note of challenge that I hope listeners will appreciate. In 2020, we saw this flowering of interest in the topic of racial justice, and particularly books on racial justice. Literally a historic number of Black authors making the New York Times bestseller list, including my book, The Color of Compromise. But since then, that interest has plummeted. I mean, it is really hard to get people to buy books on racial justice if there's not some sort of crisis happening. And my hope is that folks who listen to this and who are interested in justice wouldn't wait for the next Black death or Black tragedy to get interested again. We need to show publishers that there's always an appetite for these books around race and history and justice, because there's always an appetite for progress. But they don't know that unless you support authors like me and so many others who are talking about this subject. So the landscape for this kind of work has changed. And there's even opposition. We can talk about book bannings, anti-DEI, anti-CRT stuff. So even the people who would in years past be more open to this, they're now frightened of being labeled woke or liberal or whatever. So all that to say, your support of authors and activists and creators who talk about racial justice is critical right now, especially when we stand on the precipice of such a monumental election season and its implications for the racial justice landscape in our country. What you do really matters, and we should show publishers, the industry, and everyone that there are people who take racial justice seriously, and they do it all the time, not just when it's in a headline.
Well said, my friend. Dr. Jemar Tisby, thank you so much for being our guest this week on Good Faith Weekly. Again, the book is The Spirit of Justice, True Stories of Faith, Race, and Resistance. It is marvelous, so make certain you pick it up. Dr. Tisby, you are welcome back anytime. Thanks for being our guest this week.
Thank you.
I cannot believe we haven't had Dr. Tisby on the pod before. He was great.
He is fantastic. Just yet another of the long list of scholars and prophets that I just could listen to all day long.
Absolutely.
I mean, if you could just pay me to listen to these people, that would be amazing.
Well, I kind of do.
Do you now? Because if that could be my job description, tomorrow things are going to change a whole lot. Anywho, that's not what we're here to talk about.
No, we're talking about what Dr. Tisby had to say.
Yeah.
And there were so many things we could go on forever.
I want to talk about, and I'll confess, you generally come up, no, not generally, you do write the questions for these interviews and then we talk about them. But one of the questions, as well as a section in the book that just is, I don't know, just sticking in my head that we talked about in the interview was kind of the founding fathers and how they wrote into our documents about freedom,
right,
and about liberty, and how when you do that, guess what? At some point, all people are going to be like, yeah, me too.
Right.
And just like, duh,
Yeah.
Of course. You can't come out here saying we're going to have a nation of freedom except for these people, because the other people that you exclude are going to be like, well, why not me? Yeah. And that just kind of changed my thinking around how we've kind of gotten to this point that we are.
And that's what Dr. Tisby does so well in the book. He does not shy away from the hypocrisy of the founding fathers, especially those who were slaveholders at that time. But he also insists that the words that they crafted, the documents that they put together, unleashed, in his words, a spirit of justice across this land.
It was almost like an accidental brilliance,
right?
Yeah.
But that was such a true statement in the book and in our conversation with him, that what was unleashed during that revolutionary period and then the formation of the Constitution years later really set into motion the idea that all people are created equal and deserve inalienable rights in this country, no matter who they are, no matter what color their skin is, no matter who they love, no matter how rich or poor they are.
If they're unhoused or not, exactly, as we talked about in the opening.
Everybody.
No one's invisible. I mean,
rights. And everybody deserves to be seen and heard in this country. That's the brilliance of America, and something that we should all be able to celebrate for each other. But as you know, that hypocrisy continues even today.
It really does. And then, we fast forward to his More to Tell, which I thought was really such a good reminder about supporting creators, supporting authors, supporting folks who are out there fighting every day for justice, even in a time when it's not, on the forefront. We talked about before we started this about kind of the uprising in 2020 with all of the attention on Black Lives Matter movements and the marches and the advocacy. And he was talking about all the books that were coming out, and people were just, again, we were all stuck at home. And so we were rightly so devouring and learning and all of that. And that needs to continue. We have to support folks who are doing this work because justice isn't just a today issue, it's an everyday issue. And the minute it becomes not that, then we don't have it.
Yeah. I mean, scholars like Dr. Tisby, advocates like our very own Starlett Thomas, they are out there on the front lines doing the important work, not only in great moments of tension, but each and every day they are waking up and addressing these issues. And I am so thankful that they are doing it. They are my teachers. Mm-hmm. They are my rabbis. They are my sages, prophets, who help me get through, not only get through the day, but inspire me to be better and to advocate for a more just society.
And to understand the world through a different lens. I mean, 100%. I think we all have to do that. No matter what lens we're looking through, we have to be willing to look through a different lens and see somebody, step in somebody else's shoes, as, my parents would have said back in the day. Right. And there are people out there there are people out there that are doing this work that deserve our support continuously.
Yeah. And as we support these scholars and these advocates, it's a reminder that this is a lifelong endeavor to continue to better ourselves and to educate ourselves about all of these issues. I still love learning. I still love when that light comes on in my head and my heart begins to boil over with new information or new perspectives and ideas from individuals. And individuals like Dr. Tisby are exactly that for me. They help me so much, and I'm very appreciative, and I seek them out for their counsel. I have the responsibility to educate myself. I have the responsibility to read their books and to listen to their podcasts and to follow them on social media. And so I take that responsibility seriously and engage in it and support each and every one of them.
Absolutely. We need to be grateful for their work, for folks who are willing to take us, on a journey and share wisdom with us. And so, yes, we do need to support their work and support justice movements always.
And one last note, speaking of support, our colleague who we just mentioned, Dr. Starlett Thomas, has got a new podcast out this week.
Absolutely. Speaking of justice, and in particular, racial justice, everyone needs to check out her season 5.
Yeah, go over to the Raceless Gospel and subscribe.
The Raceless Gospel podcast. I have not heard it yet, but I hear it is phenomenal. I can't wait.
Well, when she's involved in anything, Dr. Thomas makes it great. So.
Of course. So check that out along with Dr. Jemar Tisby's book, and we'll see you back next week.
Until then, keep living good faith. You've been listening to Good Faith Weekly, hosted by Mitch and Missy Randall. This weekly podcast from Good Faith Media discusses matters of faith and culture.
Subscribe wherever you get your podcast and give us a like and a glowing review. We produce the podcast out of Norman, Oklahoma. Our music comes from Pond 5.
And we're supported by listeners like you. Learn more about us at goodfaithmedia.org.